Well, again, thanks everyone for joining us today. For those of you I haven't had the opportunity to spend much time with previously, I'm Cassie Young. I'm the EVP of Customer Success here at Sailthru. So my job is to work with your teams and your account teams at Sailthru, whether that's implementation, our account management services, technical support, and so on, to make sure that you're getting maximum value out of our platform, but also to hear your feedback more broadly about, one, what's working for your own businesses, but two, more generally, what you're seeing happen in the industry and the landscape and how we can react to that as a business at Sailthru. And so for that reason today, we're going to talk a lot about analytics. And this is a great segue from the conversation we just had with David, where we talked about this threat of analysis paralysis, right? For those of you who were at Lyft last year, you heard us talk a lot about this proliferation of big data. And there's a looming threat around that proliferation, and that it's that there's so much data that can be very hard to draw action on. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to discuss a three-part framework for assessing what I like to call the metrics that matter. When you leave today, our hope is that you have a good litmus test for which metrics really matter most. To do that, I'm going to give you the spoiler alert, and this goes back to what Neil said earlier. Pretty much everything you're going to hear me talk about right now pertains to customer retention. Why? Because customer retention is 5 times more cost-effective than customer acquisition. Think about that number for 1 minute, because 5 times is really, really material. That said, despite that reality, only 16% of marketers are actually placing primary focus on retention, which is crazy. We're going to talk a little bit more about why that may be the case, but I think going back to some of David's points, it's a really important separation that's important to recognize, because it can be the difference between growth and profitability. And you've seen a lot in the industry right now. A lot of people are talking about unicorns, right, and valuations and where those are coming from and the trade-off between the two. I think the reality is that acquisition is a very quick lever to driving those top-line growth numbers, but it can be significantly harder to drive business solvency that comes out of retention. Our goal today is to give you some ideas for some of the metrics that you can dig into that will leave you walking away with a toolkit for how to look at some of these things. So why aren't businesses focused on retention? Well, I'll share with you guys that a couple of weeks ago, we hosted an event out in San Francisco with our board member, Bill Gurley, that was very focused on the future of e-commerce. Well, lucky for us, the sub-theme of that event happened to be relevancy, right? And we talked about how important it was for businesses to win, to be differentiated based on customer experience. And to do that, retention was going to be a key driver. So we asked Bill, we said, why are all of these businesses? We shared the same statistics around where business focuses, and we said, why aren't businesses focused on retention? And he had an interesting thesis on this. He said, businesses are mostly focused on acquisition because the math is easy. Well, we're going to talk a little bit more about what he meant by that. But in short, what it means is it's relatively straightforward to know how much money you spent. How many leads did you acquire? It's a basic division formula to understand what's going on there. The challenge with that easy math is that it's very short-sighted, and because of that, it can actually be fundamentally quite flawed. So I'm going to give you guys one quick example of why focusing on the top of funnel can be very, very dangerous. About 2 years ago, we saw this big trend in acquisition marketing where everyone was focused on contests and sweepstakes. Every time you checked your email, someone else was giving you a giveaway, right? Enter your email address here, we'll enter you to win, a $5,000 giveaway. They were doing this because it was a relatively cheap cost per acquisition. If you had a $5,000 vacation getaway and you got 5,000 email addresses, you were talking about only $1 per lead. That looks pretty good. The challenge of that was when we actually dug into the data and we did a cross-client study of customers who were acquired through contests and sweepstakes versus other paid acquisition channels. What we found is that even though the relative top of funnel customer acquisition cost was quite low, those users, again, on an aggregated basis, were 63% less likely to convert into paying customers, and they were 52% more likely to opt out of your email program in the first 30 days, which was absolutely detrimental to customer lifetime value. Now, don't walk away from today saying contests and sweepstakes don't work, because there's always exceptions. I think the team at Acumen Brands actually is a great exception case. They found a very, very smart way to do giveaways and to scale those. But it's a framework for how you should be thinking about some of these topics. You don't know today what's going to happen tomorrow or a year from now. Predictive analytics are going to help us to get there. But the reality is, of that $5,000 spend and the 5,000 leads that we acquired, if none of them go on to buy, that $5,000 may have been helpful for building some brand awareness, some brand equity, but from a direct response perspective, there's absolutely no ROI around it. So we have to have that long-term view on what's playing out there. So it should go without saying then that the best marketing programs need to balance quantity and quality. This sounds like a really obvious statement, but we're still in this world where 84% of marketers are not necessarily focused on the quality piece. So let's ask ourselves the question of why. Why aren't they? Well, again, Bill's statement was, it's because the math is that much harder. We'll get to that one in a second. I think one of the big things that we're seeing at Sailthru is that, in general, marketers often fall victim to the here and now. And prior to joining Sailthru 2.5 years ago, I came from your seats. I was a customer of Sailthru actually for a number of years. And I know how annoying it was at the end of every quarter where your CEO comes around and says, why haven't we hit our number for this quarter? Can we give a discount? What type of promotion can we go do, right? And you have to do it. It particularly happens around the holidays, but it happens at regular cadence. And the challenge is a lot of times we fall so victim to that here and now that we lose the viewpoint on what the downstream effect of those optimization decisions is going to look like. And we're going to talk in just a few minutes here about exactly how important that is. The other thing that I want to talk about is the lack of tools. So we say, Bill made the comment that the acquisition math is that much easier. Well, the retention math may be a little bit harder, but it's not rocket science. The challenge is that if you look at the way marketing technology has evolved, most of the tools out there have been laser focused on acquisition. How do we help you optimize acquisition? How do we help you run very quick-winded A/B split tests, so on and so forth? And the tools haven't been there to help you focus on retention. So I'm going to ask you guys a question. How many of you, and this is a little bit shrunk down on the screen here, recognize a spreadsheet like this from month or quarter end, right? You're trying to bring together all of this data. You have some information in source A. You have 8 different Excel workbooks going. Excel only has 1 million rows, so it comes crashing down. You take it into Access. It's a complete mess. By the time you finish the cohort analysis that David mentioned to earlier, there's no time to actually do anything with the data. This is why we built our advanced analytics tool, and this is the tool that I'm going to talk to you about today. Don't worry, I'm not going to give you a demo of the product. I'm instead going to talk to you about a framework for how we approach metrics in this product. You should hopefully be able to take this framework back with you and apply it to your program regardless of the tools that you're ultimately using. So with that, I'm going to talk about our 3-pronged agenda for today. Shouldn't come as a surprise based on the intro here. The first thing that we're going to talk about is the huge, huge importance of leveraging retention data to optimize the customer acquisition mix. Neil alluded to this earlier. David spoke a lot about it in terms of the successes that Acumen has had, and we'll dig even a level deeper. The second is the importance of playing what we call the marketing long game. This is the downstream impact of the decisions that you're making today, and more importantly, using that data to optimize your decisions moving forward. And finally, we're going to talk about diving beneath what I call the surface metrics. What are surface metrics, you might be asking? Those are the balance sheet snapshot view. Our open rate is X. Our customer activation rate is Y. We need to always go a level deeper in everything that we analyze, and we're going to talk about tools for doing that today. So let's start with this notion of leveraging retention data to optimize the acquisition mix. The first thing is that you should be slicing and dicing all of your metrics by source. So this is a screen grab from a report that someone may build in Advanced Analytics. You'll see there's no metrics on here. The metrics don't matter. What matters is that we are breaking things down here in the most straightforward way by the UTM tracking that they may have set up in Google Analytics. If you are a huge spender online and are investing quite a bit in your marketing program, your sources are probably going to be that much more granular. You're not just going to be tracking Google. You're going to be tracking, was it brand keyword 1 versus a competitive keyword 2? We allow you to do that. And for those of you who aren't doing this is a conversation you can absolutely have with your customer success manager after the fact, but there's a lot of flexibility in the variables you can put on a user profile that allow you to get quite granular with tracking where these users and customers ultimately came from. One really important point, though, is that a lot of times when we think about acquisition source, we think about it, again, from the top of the funnel. We think about how many customers do we have from each one of those sources? How much did it cost us to go and acquire those? What I'm going to tell you today, though, is that acquisition data really is important at all points in the funnel, specifically as you go beyond that top count of how many customers you may have. And this is an example chart that we have here where we're looking at, inevitably a lot of our commerce companies suffer from this syndrome of the one-and-done buyer, right? We have my joke of the hour is we have a client in the UK who I talked to him about one-and-doners, and he calls them BOFOs. The politically correct version of a BOFO is bought once, flew off. He had another word that he inserted there, but the takeaway is that this is the bane of every e-commerce person's existence, right? It's these people who come in, we can't get them to come back. And so the standard approach to looking at this type of data is to say, okay, what's my customer activation rate? How many of those emails convert into customers? And then more importantly, how many of them go on to drive repeat purchases? And I could look at that number as just a snapshot. I could just say 25% of my customers are going to go on to become repeat buyers. But again, it's going to be so much more valuable if I dive a level deeper and look at it by source. So in this example, we're looking at Black Friday of last year. And we're saying, great, the holidays are a fantastic time not only to acquire new email addresses and leads, but a great time to acquire first-time customers. But how many of them come back? This is the big question that you need to be asking yourselves, because it will actually let you optimize the holiday mix for this year. And I think going back to David's team at Acumen, we've seen great examples of them harnessing all of the data, particularly from the holiday period of the year prior, to make that much smarter acquisition investment decisions in the coming year, because they know what the long-term impact of that is going to look like. So let's look at this graph for a second. What we see here is that this is just a sample of 3 sources, but the people who came in through our branded keywords on Google, well, to date, they have demonstrated a 40% repeat purchase rate. That's pretty good. Well, let's look at the source data in a slightly different capacity. Let's look at it by opt-out rate. And what we're looking at here is, longitudinally, how is the opt-out rate changing over time? And so the first thing I notice is that, well, the Black Friday giveaway, if I remember the slide before, the repeat purchase rate wasn't that fantastic there. But actually, the opt-outs have leveled out, and that looks, all told, pretty reasonable. On the flip side of that, that really attractive cohort from Black Friday that came in from the Google branded keywords, they actually have posted the highest opt-out rates, and they continue to opt out over time. So now you should be asking yourself, well, now what? They have the highest repeat purchase rates, but they're also opting out. What does this mean? Well, this is the point in the optimization puzzle where you would say to yourself, well, was the uptick in quality, measured as the repeat purchase rate, enough to offset the decrease in quantity, which is measured here by the opt-out rate? And that's going to depend, right, on the numbers that we're looking at for any given moment or any given problem. But that's how you ultimately want to be thinking about comparing and contrasting what's working versus what's not. What we see time and time again in the customer base is that inevitably a customer who's opted into the email program versus opted out is going to post on aggregate a much more materially higher lifetime value than those who do not. It's just promotion moves product, but it's the same thing on the media side. We're talking a lot about commerce today, but there's a lot of congruent examples in media. Inevitably, if you look at page views, if you look at repeat visit rates, just the frequency of visits, they're going to be significantly higher for someone where email is very, very top of mind. So my colleague Stephen Dove later this afternoon is going to talk a little bit more about the product that David alluded to earlier, which is our Sightlines product, the predictive analytics product. I want to talk to you a little about it right now because it actually has some pretty important implications from an acquisition perspective. And what precisely those implications are is that one of the predictions that we write into your account for every single unique user profile is a Rev 365 prediction, which is effectively a 1-year lifetime value proxy. So we're estimating for you, based on those machine learning algorithms, how much we think that person is going to spend over the course of a year. Well, how does that pertain to acquisition? Well, it gives you very, very quick and nimble insights into what we can expect to see from any given source. And so let's look at this example for a second where I have a number of different sources that I've run this month up on the board. Again, very high level. I'm not getting down to the granular level of an ad group, et cetera. And I'm looking at CPA. And we'll call this cost to acquire an actual customer. If it were cost to acquire an email, it'd probably be a little bit high. And the two things that you have to pay attention to here are the top two. What we see here is that Facebook is posting the highest cost to acquire a new customer, and Twitter is posting the lowest cost to acquire a new customer. So keep that in the back of your minds for a second. Now, we're going to put on top of this data the Sightline's Rev365 prediction for each one of these sources. And when we do that, what we're going to see is that Facebook, even though it was the most expensive one to go acquire, it also has the highest prediction for that Revenue 365 value. Congruently, Twitter, which was the lowest, has the lowest Revenue 365 value. Well, that could mean something good, it could mean something bad. Again, we want to go back to sort of marketing 101 or the unit economics of a customer, where as long as your lifetime value, or specifically your 1 to 2 year lifetime value, is exceeding your customer acquisition cost, you're in pretty good shape. But the bigger the gap between those two numbers, the more profitable you're going to be. And those are the types of insights that we're trying to give to you. So again, if we focus on the Facebook and Twitter example, we now will be able to optimize that much more quickly to know to say, well, Facebook looked really high. If I just saw that number in a silo, I might be a little bit alarmed. But if I'm then able to see what the predicted revenue is, it's hugely valuable. This is also helpful because it enables you to go find other customers that look like your most valuable customers. There's two ways you can do this in Sailthru. One is through predictions. Two is just through the data that's available to you in the core platform. With predictions, what you can do is you can say, well, I want to find all of my highest value users based on that Rev365 prediction and go build a lookalike for them in Facebook. That's one way to do it. Stephen will talk more about that later. Another way, though, is just to run a simple query in the core platform. You can do it in advanced analytics as well, too, to say, show me all my highest lifetime value or lifetime revenue customers, and send a lookalike audience to go out and find people who look exactly like them. Jack Threads is a customer who's done this over the course of the past year. They've had a 7.7 times decrease in ROAS by doing this, or increase in ROAS. So huge, huge returns in terms of what's going on here. So instead of just going out there and building on segments based on gender or household income or likes, we're doing it looking at all of the different factors that go into what makes a customer valuable and then targeting people who look exactly like it so that you get a more efficient return on your ad spend. So that's a little bit about acquisition. We're going to come back to some of those points in a few minutes here. The next idea is this notion of playing the long game. So what does the long game mean? It's this longitudinal view. And quite frankly, this is one of the reasons that there was so much impetus behind the advanced analytics product initially. This product's been around for about 2 years now at this point. It's that we wanted to make it very, very straightforward for all of our customers to be able to track the decisions that they're making on that longer term view. So what does this look like? Well, on the screen right now, you're going to see a chart that actually shows revenue attrition by email address acquired. So what's on the chart doesn't really matter. I'm going to talk to you more about the application and the context for this type of data. So just quickly so you understand what we're looking at, if I look at the first line, it would be a cohort of emails that were acquired on September 22nd. And then I'm tracking how much revenue I make per each one of those email addresses on a daily, weekly, monthly, whatever the basis may be moving forward. What you really need to take away from this chart is that we recognize a lot of money right away, right when the customers sign up, right when they buy for the first time. And then there's material attrition in that over time. Inevitably, further to the right, we see those numbers pop back up. Typically, that's because it's Black Friday, it's Cyber Monday. Maybe we ran a great sale. We're able to reactivate a lot of those customers then. But there's actually attrition to what's there. This, when Bill talked about the math being a little bit harder, this is what he was getting at. So let me give you guys an example. After we actually had this talk a couple weeks ago around the importance of retention and on differentiating on customer experience, one of our sales guys came up to me and said, how do we get people to listen to us? He said, why aren't more people focused on retention and how do we prove it? And my first thought was to share with you guys what I already said, which was marketers are consumed with this here and now vision. They don't have the tools to do it. So that wasn't an acceptable enough answer to me, so I spent a bunch of time scrubbing data in Excel, just dummy data for an e-commerce customer. And what I sought to look at was what happens to a cohort of customers over a 2-year period if you're able to just very slightly improve the purchase frequency of that particular customer. And I'll give you the context for why I looked at this. My thesis in answering that question was, let's go back to the example of your CEO is asking you why you're not hitting Black Friday numbers. So you're not hitting the numbers, you react by just pushing product and pushing promotion that given day. But what I would challenge every marketer to think about is, if instead of having to react in that moment, you had focused on all of your previous cohorts and on keeping them really engaged over time, how much less money would you have had to have made up for if they were still buying from you that day? Well, I'm going to put a number on it. And my number is very back of the envelope because I just, again, plugged some assumptions into Excel. But I looked at a group of customers over 2 years that had a $50 average order value. And I said, what if we could just improve the purchase frequency by 20% over that 2-year period? What would that do for that one cohort's revenue? It's an 8% lift in revenue. If you're looking at an 8% improvement on revenue on Black Friday, that's incredibly material. That was just for one cohort. If you begin to compound that, it becomes that much richer and richer. Again, it's very, very easy to fall victim to the need to be able to present tests now. We run A/B splits, we run multivariate tests to drive conversions, but we need to be focused more on this talk track of what is the downstream impact of what we do. We're going to go through another example of this in a second that will hopefully help you all to go back to your CEOs with a business case that gets you a little bit of buy-in and just put one group of customers to the side to really focus on the longitudinal impact that David spoke about earlier. I think you heard from him straight from the horse's mouth. It's had a huge impact for them on their profitability and long-term customer value. We'd love to see that play out in other places. So to do that, I want to talk to you a little bit about what I call a revenue intake curve. So what is this curve? This is a group of customers who activated on my birthday, January 12th, 2014. And we are tracking, that's not my actual birthday, January 12th. We're tracking the revenue from that cohort over time. And same thing, what we're seeing here is what we saw on the last slide. We get a lot of money on the first day, and then we see the attrition take place over time. Other people will call this a degradation curve. It's the more pessimistic view on the intake curve. All you need to remember from this chart that I have in front of you right now is the number 15.6%. 15.6% is how much of this cohort's revenue is going to come in on day one. Of all of the money that they're ever going to generate, we'll call it on a 1-year basis for now, 15.6% of it comes today. Why is this important? Well, let's say that we're going back to our acquisition spend. And today, I spend $100,000 on an ad placement. Well, as I said earlier, it can be really hard to tell what the people I acquire for that $100,000 are going to go do longer term. We have sightlines that's going to help you out a little bit with that now, but what can you do if you don't have sightlines? Well, while you don't know precisely what that group is going to go do, you know what they do today. So we know we spent $100,000, and we'll say in this hypothetical example that that group spent $5,000 today, the group that came in from that ad placement. So $5,000, if we remember from our previous chart, is 15.6% of the total revenue that we're going to expect to take in from this cohort, because we remember that day one revenue was only 15.6% of the greater pie. So I'm just going to do some basic math here, not quite as basic as the acquisition math, right, because we said it's going to be a little bit harder. And we're saying if I take $5,000 and I divide that by 15.6%, we're at $32,000 estimated revenue in a 1-year period. So you might be saying, so what? Well, we now know that we have a $32,000 estimated revenue that we're going to make, but that we spent $100,000 to go acquire that cohort of users. That math doesn't line up. So very quickly, we're able to say $32,000 expected cohort lifetime value versus $100,000 acquisition cost. That math's just simply not going to work, right? Now, certainly this would depend on the payback period we're looking at. There's a lot of other variants that could go into this. But the idea here is to allow you to move that much more nimbly. And it allows you to take the retention data and actually factor it into your acquisition decisions and mixes. Of course, there are always going to be investments that you make that buck the trend. I'll share with you guys, so a number of years ago, I ran subscription marketing for a company called theladders.com here in New York. We did a job search website. And back in the day, when LinkedIn was getting started, they let us advertise on their website, and they charged us an arm and a leg to do it. And when we first started doing it, we said, this is crazy, the cost per acquisition is so high. And then when we looked, however, we were a freemium subscription product. When we looked at the freemium conversion rate of the cohorts of users who came in from LinkedIn versus other sources, it was over 4x the conversion rate. So the actual lifetime revenue was enough to actually absorb the cost. So again, you may always see what your initial trends are going to look like bucked in the longer term, but our thesis is that it's going to be significantly better for you and your job if you can turn off the leaky bucket that much sooner and restart it if the downstream data actually does go and disprove you. But this allows you to act that much more quickly. So to do this, to play the long game, it's absolutely critical that you have the cohort view. And I promise I didn't pay David to make all of these comments about cohorts. It's just we both are very, very passionate about them in terms of the ability to look at what the long-term impact is of the decisions. And so when I talk about cohorts, I'm saying they're very different from an A/B split test. And we'll talk about an example of that in a minute. To go back to David, I wanted to dig a little bit deeper into a case study from this company that I absolutely love. And as David mentioned before, you can show people boots over and over and over again, but at some point, it doesn't matter how much they love boots. There's going to be a fatigue factor from what's there. So if we look back to when he talked about batch and blast, their emails may have looked a little bit like Sell A, right? They're getting the boot treatment. But as their business evolved, they went more to this content-first approach that he talked about, which was Sell B, and more of the content-based approach. And the importance here goes back to what David was talking about, where it's a difference between driving transactions and driving relationships. And the bigger question from a metrics perspective is you may be looking at what drives conversions today, but more important is what wins in terms of driving lifetime cohort revenue. Because we'll put this in another view for just a second here. If I were to look at it as campaign A versus campaign B, and this is dummy data, if I just look at the total number of emails I send and the total number of conversions I drive, I'm going to say, oh, well, campaign A had a 5.4% conversion rate, campaign B had 4.2, campaign A won. That would be one way to look at it. But what if I then pulled up a curve to look at this data longitudinally? And what I'm looking at longitudinally is, what is the lifetime revenue per email address that I acquire over time? And even though B was a little bit lower on this first day of deployment because fewer people converted, they're generating more money for me over time. That's why I asked David the question earlier around how he balances the trade-offs between lightweight testing and this longer-term longitudinal view of things. It's a really, really hard thing to do as a marketer, and we are ready and armed to help anyone in the room who wants to make that business case to the higher-ups of their company, because it's so hugely important. And it's not to discount the importance of A/B testing at all, because we all know that increasing opens increases the volume of people who we can ultimately drive to conversions or drive to lifetime revenue, but it doesn't guarantee profitability and solvency. So it's really important to be cognizant of those trade-offs. So now we're going to talk a little bit about our third bucket, which is diving beneath the surface metrics. Any of you who have seen me present before, I have one slide that I basically force our marketing team to put into every presentation that I do. They're probably just absolutely upset in the background, but I have to have you here because it's an important point around surface metrics. And that important point is this egregious number that keeps coming back to haunt us. It's when you ask marketers what metric they look at to determine the efficacy of their email performance, 66% of them say open rates, right? And this is the slide you guys are all waiting for. It's that reaction, right? It's alarming to us that this is where people are focused. It's alarming to us for two reasons. One, it goes back to the top of funnel stuff that we were talking about. Really, really important to focus on the solvent longitudinal view. Second, open rates are they're a snapshot surface metric. There's so much more that lies beneath those, and we're going to talk about those today. So I'm going to indulge the crowd for a minute, and I'm going to say, okay, we can look at open rates. Let's think about what looking at open rates beneath the surface metric would actually look like. So if we do that, what we'll see is that instead of looking at just open rates, maybe I want to break this down. So instead of just saying, oh, well, I have a 29% open rate, I'm going to dig in a level deeper and say, what's my open rate on a cohort basis? Or what's my open rate by acquisition source? So in this example, a sample chart we might look at is to say, based on the sign-up month of the cohort, what was their open rate a month into getting your emails, 2 months into getting your emails, 3 months, so on and so forth. And you're going to see again that that number is going down over time. They're becoming disengaged. My shameless plug for personalization. If you're personalizing, you should see less of a degradation along that curve. But this happens. And you want to have actionable data around this, because what you can then go do is to say, well, if my users are disengaging after 30 days, maybe I want to automate a re-engagement email, or maybe I want to find some other way to keep the content really fresh for them. So this is some of the types of data you can look at there. Another way you could do this is based on the acquisition source. So I can't tell you how often we'll have customers come to us and they'll say, something really weird is happening with, we think it must be with deliverability, because we've seen opens and clicks go way down. We don't know what's going on. And 9 times, I would say 99 times out of 100, when we dig into that, what we actually see is that's not a deliverability problem. It's that the acquisition mix will have shifted materially. And they're going now and acquiring customers through unknown, unproven sources, and those users will be significantly less likely to engage. Again, not using contests as a rule, but that's a place where we see it happen a lot. I think especially if the lists are acquired in a co-branded way, or people don't know exactly what to expect with what they're going to receive, we can see that disengagement really be a problem. So the point on this front is that variables in the Sailthru platform are really going to be your key to success on this. So just as a quick refresher on the platform, so there's 2 really key variable forms within Sailthru. There's variables on the customer level, and there's variables on the purchase level. There's variables elsewhere in the platform as well too, but from an analytics perspective, this is what's going to be really important. One of the great things about the Mongo platform that we're built on is that it allows you the flexibility to very easily add new variables to a customer record or to a purchase at any given point in time. So customer level variables, classic example would be acquisition source, but you could also score them for they've written a product review. If you're a media company, they're paying for a paid subscription. They've written a comment on an article. Any information that you have, you can then write to that user profile. On the purchase variable side, there's a lot of different stuff you could do. You could say the source that it came from. Was it via mobile app, via the the mobile optimized site? Was it discount or was it full price? A lot of flexibility for the stuff that you can pass there. The more data you pass in, the richer the set you're going to have to analyze. And the goal of advanced analytics, and what I'll say now is we have a demo station set up in the back for those of you who haven't seen it. But if you haven't, I really encourage you to go check it out, because the crux of advanced analytics is when you log in, there's hundreds of prefabricated reports for both commerce companies and media companies. But the crux of the tool, from my point of view, is the data cube that sits in there. So this is really more in line with your traditional business intelligence cube, where you can slice and dice the data. It's basically a pivot table on steroids, right? The more of those variables that you pass in, the more lenses you have to actually cut that data, and you can get some really, really rich insights out of it. And so one example, I gave this one before, is what if instead of just looking at open rates, you wanted to look at recent open behavior based on whether or not someone had written a product review? So you're seeing here, I'm looking at a cohort basis, again, because we love cohorts. How many people have opened in the last 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, never, and then breaking that out for people who've written reviews versus haven't. And open behavior, again, that's very top of the funnel. We could also cut this data by what's average order value for people who have written reviews versus not. What's the repeat purchase rate? Any of the metrics that we want to look at, we can bring back into this. For media companies, it's the same thing. You could look at it from a page view perspective. You could look at it from an opt-out perspective, so on and so forth. The point here, though, is not just to have the data. It's to have the data and go take action against it, right? So our goal with the advanced analytics product is not to say, here's another tool to go use. It's to make analyzing all this data possible in one place, that single point of truth that David spoke about earlier, so that you actually have time freed up to focus on the strategic and analytical activities that are actually going to drive change in your business. So you see, for instance, again, I'm not going to optimize off open rates, but let's say hypothetically, my chart here was, lifetime value. We looked at on a cohort basis based on whether or not people have written reviews. If I see that people who write reviews are significantly more engaged, well, it could be a little bit of a chicken and an egg scenario where maybe they write reviews because they're going to buy anyway and they're a huge advocate and champion of the brand. Or maybe they actually just have a great user experience after they write the review. Maybe you have a drip series that follows up on that. Point being, I'm probably going to try to push people to write reviews. Or maybe reviews have a higher impact on conversion rate on the page. We want to cut this data in a lot of different ways. One thing I'll mention here is that context around metrics is hugely important, and it's something that you don't want to lose sight of as you run this analysis. I was at another conference last week, and I was sitting next to someone from a travel website, and he's focused on the mobile product. And he was telling me that one of the hardest parts about his job is that everyone's pushing him to basically optimize bounce and exit rates, right? But his argument was that he had made some of these sites so efficient at what they do that bounce or exit rates might actually go up. It actually could be an okay thing in certain parts of the site, right? So you always just want to take a step back and think about, what you're ultimately optimizing for. Is it for conversion? Is it for user experience? If it's for user experience, how are you going to measure that? If you can't measure it today, what's your plan to measure it 6 months from now, a year from now? But context is very, very important to that. Another example here is thinking about purchase variables. So the last one we showed a customer variable example. In this one, we're talking about, well, what's the average order value by channel? So I'm looking at it for in-store. We have a lot of customers now who are sending us the point of sale data through the purchase API. Is it in the web store? Is it in the mobile app? So on and so forth. And again, we can cut this data in a lot of different ways. I'm looking at it as a snapshot view here. I could also look at it by cohort. What would I see if I looked at it by cohort? Well, maybe suddenly I would see a large spike in conversions for the mobile app at some point in time, or a spike in average order value. Well, maybe the mobile app wasn't perfectly optimized when it first launched, but now I can look at it on a time basis and see when that change happened, what was the impact of it? Was it good, bad, ugly? How do I want to react to it? One other example to think about here is the customer state is really, really important. What do I mean by that? Well, one of my favorite examples of digging beneath the surface is actually a merchandising insight. So a lot of times when we talk to customers, specifically when we're developing like a welcome stream for customers and we're focused on converting non-buyers into buyers for the first time, they'll talk to me about their best sellers, right? So they'll say to me, oh, well, we always are going to focus the best sellers in the emails for the first 14 days because we know that jewelry and accessories move the needle. It's what people buy. It's a slightly lower price point. It's where they always go for. Well, one of the first reports that we built in advanced analytics was to say, we know you know your top sellers. What happens when we cut this by customer state? So for non-buyers, for people who've bought once. So what that did for us, what it said to us was, well, not what are your best sellers all around. What are your best sellers for converting non-buyers into buyers for the first time? And that jewelry and accessories example I gave you, that's a real one. We had a customer who was doing that. When they dug into that data, they found out that even though overall those were the top sellers, the products most likely to convert non-buyers to buyers for the first time were kitchen and home. So we went back, we revamped the welcome stream to be very, very focused on kitchen and home, had a very material lift on first 30-day buyers for what they were ultimately going out and doing that. You could do the same thing. I think the Acumen team has done a deep dive into 2 times purchasers and 3 times purchasers. There's a lot of different ways that you can cut that cake. So these are, again, just some general insights. Again, our goal of today's session is not to say you got to go have advanced analytics to do all of this stuff. This stuff is possible, right? If you have a BI tool that you're using, you can elbow grease it in Excel to a certain degree. We wanted you to walk away with a framework for how you could go about attacking this. We are going to have a demo station set up in the back today and tomorrow if you want to check out more about it. We're also, tomorrow, I think, going to have a case study floating around. What's important about that case study is it actually features a media client, Sherman's Travel Media. So a lot of the examples that I gave today were commerce, but as I said, there's a lot of congruencies in media. So it's a great thing to check out. This is a quick snippet from another client. I think Bruce may be here today somewhere from Deal News around what they're doing with advanced analytics, another great example of bringing in a lot of the acquisition data to look at what's happening long term. But again, just to quickly recap, 3 things to focus on. One is make sure you are bringing the retention data back into the acquisition mix. Just quick show of hands. How many people in the room today are feeding the retention data back to the acquisition team at their companies? How many of you would like to be doing that? How many of you don't want to be doing that? All right, well, we got to convince that third bucket a little bit. But I think there's tremendous opportunity for what's there. The second is play the long-term view. You got to look at cohorts. You have to have the longitudinal focus. Again, it's the slightly harder math, but it can be the stepping stone between just top-of-funnel growth and really driving profitability and business solvency. And third is diving beneath the surface metrics. So it's not enough just to see a number and take it at face value. You always want to be breaking it down further, and those variables allow you a lot of flexibility. So with that, we're going to open it up to questions for a few minutes. We have runners on both sides with mics. So just raise your hand, and we will bring you a mic. We obviously didn't get the coffee out early enough today. This is the mid-afternoon start. It was a little awkward. Yep, Tracy.
On the revenue prediction, is it based solely on acquisition channel, or are there other elements and other data variables that go into that?
It's a great question. So the question again was on the revenue prediction, is it only based on acquisition, or is there other data that plays into that? The predictions are actually based on a ton of different factors. Acquisition is just one way to cut the data. The factors that play into it are more around overall cross-channel engagement, right? So it'll be things like open recency, purchase frequency, how recently you came to the site, and what we found is we actually did a tornado analysis of which factors were most likely to impact what played out there. And we all had our assumptions for what they would be, and they were less obvious than you would think. So one of the biggest drivers for that revenue propensity or that lifetime value number isn't even email frequency, it's the time lapse between emails, right? So there's a lot of different things that play into that. There's also a Sightlines booth back in the back. They can dive in deeper, but Stephen will go into quite a bit of detail around all the stuff that plays into it. But point being, acquisition is more of a way to filter the data than one that actually drives the predictions that are there. Well, if we don't have any other questions, I'm going to assume that you're going to save them for the Advanced Analytics demo station. And we do have a 10-minute break right now before we hear from one of our partners. So thank you guys again for joining us. We're really excited about the content we have ahead for you, and have a great rest of the afternoon.